Hello there, listeners, and let me start this broadcast by apologising. Things have been slow here on the Spirit Radio. Problems in real life have led to a few delays in broadcasting, and I do apologise for all of our loyal listeners out there. So, as a gift, think of it as an early Christmas present or a late Halloween present, if you will. I thought that for once I would perform a reading of a horror story, just to keep you interested and to keep this channel alive and well, or undead as it might be. Now, let's begin. Insomnia is a dreadful thing. Blessed is the rare person who has never suffered from it, even in the mildest form. He is lucky to be unacquainted with those endless dark hours when no kind of counting, reading, soothing drink or calming pill takes effect, when every striking of the clock is heard and agonizingly counted, when bitter self-analysis and dread imaginings increase in intensity and conviction as the hours pass. He is fortunate indeed if he has never gone to bed at 10, longing to sleep but knowing that it will be 1 or 2 before he will do so, or certain that, however quickly sleep may take him, he will have to endure at least 4 hours between waking and breakfasting. 4 hours of cock-crowing and dawn chorus, and with his resistance at its lowest, imaginings of inevitable death and possible suicide. At such times, sound sleepers in the household are much envied, their taken-for-granted oblivion ever resented. Undisturbed by worry, imagination, or fear, they sleep like animals. And who ever heard of an animal with insomnia? But there have been instances. One occurred in Georgia, in the southern United States of America, where some 50 years ago a well-bred farmer with the aristocratic name of Walsingham bought a very reasonably priced farm at Oakville on the Savannah River. There was a nice house in that charming colonial style which rivals most of Europe's small house architecture in welcoming grace. With the Walsingham's many elegant examples of American country-style furniture installed, it appeared both to the family and some of their visitors that here had been a bargain indeed. The neighbours too seemed friendly and were pleased to accept the new settlers' invitations to call and dine. There was a pleasant daughter, Amelia, to be admired, and for those who liked to contemplate a noble animal, a great mastiff enjoying the name of Don Caesar. There was also a cat who, fortunately for his skin, was good friends with the dog who towered above him. The Walsinghams had been in their home for some months, and were considered well settled when Don Caesar began to grow restless. His trouble was insomnia. While the cat would doze happily as before, curled up near his vast friend, the latter could be seen to be disturbed by something which caused him to shift about, and lift his head to look round, and get up and prowl and flop uneasily down again, only to be up once more within a moment. He was not his old self at all, and more than once he was seen to lunge testily at the unoffended cat, as if jealous of its serenity. Night-time was his worst. Instead of dreaming away the hours, sighing and twitching in pleasurable imaginings, he could be heard prowling about, not knowing what he wanted, but unable to compose himself to rest. Sometimes he would growl long and low and bark, but there seemed to be no cause beyond his own discomforted state. The Walsinghams heard all of this too, because they were no longer enjoying nightly oblivion. One by one they had first been awakened by noises as though there might be intruders about the place. Mr. Walsingham had gone down and looked around, but had found nothing stirring, except the unhappy Don Caesar. Another night there had been long, incessant peals at the doorbell. Hurrying to answer them, the farmer had found no one there, but some pieces of furniture in the downstairs room had been shifted and 1 or 2 overturned. The house sounds soon became a nightly occurrence, often accompanied by the ringing of the bell. The family began to suspect that their neighbours might not be as friendly as they seemed, or had found out how little they had to pay for the house and farm, and were resentfully trying to drive them out. But they were intelligent people and soon dropped this notion as absurd. The noises continued. Furniture was now being moved or knocked over nightly, and several pieces had suffered damage. What with this, the ringing of the bell and the barking of Don Caesar, no one could get a good night's sleep. Of all of them, the poor dog seemed to be the most affected by insomnia. He slept neither by night nor by day. Sleepless dogs do not develop bags under the eyes, but their nerves and tempers are just as vulnerable as any human insomniacs. One morning the family hastened downstairs towards his frenzied barking coming from the hall. They halted on the stairs as they caught sight of him, his great legs braced, coat bristling, neck strained forward, eyes staring as he barked incessantly at nothing. Suddenly the huge dog's last restraint seemed to give away. With a snarling roar of rage he sprang, as if at an invisible throat. Then the watching family saw a remarkable and terrible thing happen. At the height of his lunge the dog was stopped. For a moment he writhed in midair, threshing his limbs and body, twisting his head this way and that. He might have been gripped about the throat by someone stronger than he who was holding him aloft, throttling him. Yet there was no one in that hall except the strangled dog and the horrified watchers on the stairs. With a gurgling cry, Don Caesar was suddenly propelled backwards. He thudded to the floor and lay still. It was some moments before the family dared approach him. Their fear that he might spring up at them in this madness was unnecessary. Don Caesar was dead, of a broken neck. Now it is a well-known fact that animals can see and sense things which humans cannot. We ourselves have seen dogs and cats bristle and widen their eyes at an empty chair or corner of the room, and slowly follow with their gaze the movements of something which, long to discern as we will, we cannot. What the Walsinghams had watched that morning went beyond this, though. And yet in that disturbed household where a gigantic dog had been terrified, frantic, and then throttled by nothing more tangible than the air around him, the cat continued to behave as serenely as if he was perpetually surrounded by doting admirers. He sat on empty chairs, purring and closing his eyes and smoothing back his ears as though invisible hands were stroking him from head to tail. He leaned against nothing and rubbed against it and curled his tail around it and smiled and purred. He was the one easy member of that household, and his calm gave the rest of them optimism that their troubles were due to quite ordinary causes and would soon pass. In this frame of mind, Amelia Walsingham was perhaps shocked more than she might have been otherwise when she had been for one evening. As she sat at her dressing-table preparing for bed, she felt a touch on her shoulder, and glancing into the mirror saw a hand there. The hand was a man's, coarse and gnarled. It was covered with black hair, and there was nothing attached to it at all. Once more the family managed to come to terms with a horror which would have driven many people out of the house on the instant. Most of us will put up with a great deal before we will subject ourselves to the upheaval of removal. Though Amelia's screams had been dreadful to hear, she was persuaded to believe that she had dozed briefly at the dressing-table, and, waking with a start, had been frightened by a movement of reflected shadows or light. Whether Mr. Walsingham was really convinced of this, or whether he was putting up a show of confidence for the benefit of his womenfolk, an event a few days later left him in no personal doubt that something rather nasty was afoot on his property. Afoot literally, for at the time he was strolling across the dewy grass of his garden which fell away to the Savannah River. It was a perfect morning, a time when a man might least expect to encounter the supernormal. Yet as Mr. Walsingham walked and glanced down at his feet, he saw forming themselves in the soft, dewy ground beside him a parallel line of footprints, and they were of the naked feet of a man. This was the last but one experience Mr. Walsingham or any of his family underwent at this place. the last one of all they shared with a number of neighbours. After it, there could be no more self-delusion. It was that same evening, and the neighbours had come in for a meal. Despite their ordeal of late, the Walsinghams were entertaining their friends cheerfully, and a relaxed mood prevailed. If the cat, on a chair on the corner, was apparently being stroked to its visible and audible delight by someone who was clearly not there, this was merely put down to eccentricity, his game. Conversation was proceedingly spirited and gaily at the table when suddenly it was interrupted by a loud, long groan. Assembled diners do not normally pay obvious heed to sound, which might be due to one of their number's digestive misfortune, but this was so obviously a groan, and so loud, and so located in the room above the dining room, that everyone stopped speaking at once, and stared at the ceiling. As they stared, a bead of red was seen to form on the plaster. It grew, elongated, and fell, and where it landed on the tablecloth, it made what for all the world looked like a blood stain. Almost at once, another drop followed it, and then another. Gesturing to the other men present, Mr. Walsingham leapt to his feet and dashed from the room. The men followed him, leaving their ladies to stare as though hypnotized at the falling drops and the spreading red stain. Reaching the top of the stairs, Walsingham flung himself into the bedroom above the dining room. It was empty. Hurrying to the middle of the floor, he knelt to examine the close carpeting. There was no mark on it. He only hesitated a moment, and then told the men who had followed him to rip up the carpet along the walls while he moved furniture aside to let it be turned back. They heaved the carpet back together and exposed the wooden flooring. It was unmarked. A film of undisturbed dust was plainly visible on the varnish. Running downstairs again, the men found the women standing around the table, hands to their mouths, watching the inexorable drip from above. The stain had now spread on the tablecloth, and was a foot or more across. Then, as they watched, the dripping ceased. The men rushed upstairs again. The bedroom was still as empty and quiet as they had left it, the dust on the floorboards still undisturbed. Walsingham went down and ripped off the tablecloth. In the morning he took it to a local physician for an opinion upon the stain. A microscope soon settled that. It was human blood. That was the end of the Walsingham sequence of unnerving experiences, for they left the house soon afterwards. No one else moved in. There had been too many guests at that final supper for any part of the neighbourhood not to hear of what had happened. Some years passed. The pretty house remained empty and deteriorating. The horrific tales became local legend, scarcely credited by the more cynical, younger members of the Oakville community. One of these was Horace Gunn, a particularly sceptical young man. He hesitated when offered a worthwhile bet that he wouldn't spend 24 hours alone in the house. But he accepted, and thinking to get quickly over the worst of the ordeal, went there just after sundown and settled in for a night's vigil. Next morning his wagerers decided to check on him. They drove out to the farm and hooted for Horace as they approached it. He did not come to the door. They knocked, then peered through windows. There was no sign of him. Triumphantly they prepared to go back to town, seek him out, and make him pay up. Someone suggested that since they were there, they may as well go inside the house and have a look around. Forcing a window, they clambered in. In what had been the dining room, they found Horace Gunn. He lay spread-eagled on the floor, his throat swollen and terribly bruised with the distinct mark of long fingers. Horace Gunn was not dead, but he was never the same man again, though he was able eventually to tell what had happened that night. His first act on shutting himself into the farmhouse had been to light an oil lamp, or rather try to light it. Each time he struck a match it was puffed out sharply, as though by someone standing at his shoulder. Giving this up after many exasperated attempts, he knelt to the grate and tried to kindle the fire lit there. Again, every match was extinguished before he could touch it to the paper. Feeling by now a deal less sceptical than before, he considered going home. But the wager and his not inconsiderable courage determined him to stick it out. He sat down in the dark and waited. For there was no sound save what might be attributed to the creaking of wood and the patter of small creatures in the abandoned house. Suddenly, from below where Gunn was sitting, there resounded a blood-freezing scream. It was followed by sounds of hysterical pursuit up and down stairs and through other rooms, with the bursting open and slamming of doors as though someone were after another for his very life. The din ceased at last, and Horace Gunn breathed again, believing that perhaps he now had to come through all the ordeal he would have to endure, and he'd only sit through the remaining hours to his reward. He was never more wrong in his life. As he crouched there, in the pitch dark, he became aware that at one point on the wall opposite him a speck of light was beginning to appear. He stared as it grew and spread into a ball of light, in the midst of which there were, slowly materializing, a man's head. It grew more and more distinct. There appeared long grey hair, staring eyes of misery and madness, and a bloody temple lacerated by a gaping wound. The worst thing about it, however, was that it was starting to move at about the height of a man's head from the ground, and it was coming his way. Terrified, Horace Gunn backed away, groping into the darkness behind him. Suddenly the head vanished as though extinguished by a switch, but Gunn had had enough. He stumbled towards where he believed the door to be. Whether he tripped or whether he swore afterwards a hand grasped his ankle and jerked him to the floor is not known, but there could be little doubting the truth of his description of the unseen hands which grasped his throat and choked him until he lost consciousness. For there were the finger marks for his friends to see the next day. This latest horror at the Oakville farmhouse was widely reported and discussed in the newspapers of the South and elsewhere as many theories were put forward. The most interesting detail to emerge was that some weeks after Walsingham had bought the farm, a quantity of fresh bones had been unearthed in the corner of one of the plantations. Dismissing his farmhand's assertion that they were human remains, the farmer had had them destroyed. Although the farm had stood for 70 years before that without any signs of supernormal disturbance, trouble in plenty had broken loose afterwards. The moral clearly is to let sleeping bones lie, and to know that brave dogs do not get insomnia for nothing. Well, there we are, something a little different for the channel. I'm hoping to be able to do several other projects on this channel, not just the Spirit Radio as it's gradually evolving, but also a few terrifying tales read for your enjoyment. I'm also hoping to be able to work on another fictional project. Here's hoping that that's a success, and that you will continue to support me and all of those who help to make this channel as successful as it is. Just remember that night time is our time, and I am forever your gracious and grateful host.